Welcome to the podcast, Scattered, One Person's Search for the Story Behind Human Remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. I had all these wonderful notes and news to give you, and things changed. This morning, I woke up to the smell of smoke. Smoke from wildfires at least 200 kilometers away had been blown south to Calgary. And this morning I thought, the ash from the remains of my childhood homes might be in this wind. Wildfires in Alberta are already raging across the province. It's only May, and fires have already burned over 400,000 hectares. Towns have been evacuated and people's homes have been lost. This includes my hometown of Drayton Valley. The town was evacuated on May 7th and continues today, which is May 16th, 2023. And today, I hear some essential workers are being let back into the town, but as of last week, I heard the fire had burned 4 houses. And it's likely that I lived in 3 of those houses as a child. 2 of them were built by my dad. It's a difficult thing to hear that your childhood homes may be lost forever. I was hit by a whole bunch of emotions last week when I heard this news. I haven't set foot in those homes for nearly 40 years. I haven't lived in Drayton Valley for 30 years, but the grief was still real and raw. It still is. I've jotted down some thoughts in my latest blog post at The Reluctant Archaeologist. Feel free to read it. I have included the link in the show notes. And I can only imagine what those families who lived in those homes are currently going through. I have donated to the Red Cross to provide some help for those affected by the wildfires. Drayton was merely one community out of many, many in Alberta, Western Canada, and in Canada who have been affected by wildfires this year alone. If you're interested, you can donate too. I've put the link in the show notes. While this podcast started out focusing on the search and discovery of scattered human remains, it's slowly becoming more than that, because there is more involved than just the human remains. There is the grief, the loss, and the absence that many, many people the world over have to face every day. Not everyone has to face the charred and perhaps scattered remains of their home. However, each of us must deal with loss at some point in our lives. The loss of a job, the loss of our youth, the loss of a beloved pet. Grief doesn't care what has been lost. Grief arrives when we feel the absence of something. Grief is the price we pay for love, as the late Queen Elizabeth II was quoted to say. I love those 2 houses my dad built, and I am grieving their loss. On to a lighter note, the scavenging study is continuing again this year. This is our 3rd season in Alberta. We plan to set up a site in the Drayton Valley area. As I mentioned, I am from there, and a friend graciously reached out to her family and helped to arrange a place where we could put a couple dead pigs and monitor any visiting scavengers. Drayton is near Crown land or government land and is surrounded by forest that extends into and beyond the Rocky Mountains to the west. I remember encountering a lot of wildlife when I grew up there. Heck, I had bears in my backyard. And I knew we get lots of scavenger action on those pigs. However, the research team decided over winter that we were going to concentrate on going east instead of west. And I had to call this wonderful, generous landowner in Drayton to say thank you, but not this year. As it happens, it was likely a good thing with all the wildfires. I hope and pray that that landowner is doing well and is safe. Meanwhile, me, Sherry, and the Calgary Police and a conservation officer attempted to get to one of our Calgary area sites last week, and it was a bit of a bust. We needed to cross a creek to get to our closed and open sites, and the creek was already too high with water runoff from the Rocky Mountains. Usually this happens in June, and it's at least a month early this year. So we couldn't cross the creek, and we decided to call it a day before noon. Actually, no, we got out there about 1:30, so it was probably only an hour or two in, and we decided to call it a day. And it was a good thing because there were storms approaching. We saw thunder and lightning, and then as we started to go back to Calgary, we encountered a bit of a flash storm, and there was hail and slushy sleet and inches of something on the road, and cars were pulled off the road, and it was just chaos. So it was a good thing that we didn't get to the sites, and we called it a day. So we'll need to put off that site until the spring runoff has died down a bit and we can cross that creek. However, we are planning to visit other sites that were set up last year in the coming months, and Sherry and the team will also be setting up new sites as well. If you'd like to learn more about the scavenging study, go to my website, yvonnechorlin.com, and look under the anthropology tab under the podcast where I have hidden the link, and the link scavenging study is there at the top of the podcast page. Go have a look. There's lots of videos on there, and you can see what we've done and hopefully what we'll do in the future. If you'd like to support the podcast, please buy me a coffee. The link is in the show notes. You can purchase a virtual coffee or multiple coffees, and the money will go towards web hosting, soon to be transcriptions of these podcast episodes as soon as I can find time to do the transcriptions, and also my participation in the scavenging study with Dr. Sherry Forbes. Also, I don't have too many social media platforms because there's only so much time in the day. So while I'm not on Twitter or TikTok or what have you, I do have a Facebook page. Reach out and tell me what you liked about an episode or what you want to hear next. Or, you know what, share some news about dead people. That's always good. You can connect with me on the Reluctant Archaeologist Facebook page. You can contact me via the form on my website, yvonnechorlin.com, or you can email me at yvonnechorlin@gmail.com. I have met so many amazing and wonderful people on this podcast. I feel very privileged. And one of them is Sherry, who you'll hear from next. When I'm next in London, I fully intend on taking Sherry out for a pint because we could have talked for hours. I hope you enjoy. So, Sherry, I'm going to get you to say your name because I'm not even going to attempt it. And your position and what you do.
Okay, no worries at all. I get that quite a lot, actually. So my full name is Sherry Nakhaeizadeh. As you can hear from my surname, it's quite an unusual surname, and it's basically because my ethnicity is Iranian. My parents are from Iran, but I was raised in Sweden. I came to Sweden when I was only 9 months old. Hence that my British accent is not fully British. You might hear the twang of Swedish in the background of that. I'm currently a lecturer, or what people in America or Canada might refer to an assistant professor in crime and forensic science at the Department of Security and Crime Science at University College London. And I've been employed as a lecturer since, I need to think now, 2019, I believe. Yeah, 2019. So 4 years almost.
And take us through your academic journey, through undergrad, through PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my undergrad in Sweden. I wanted to become Indiana Jones. I loved history and
who doesn't, right?
Exactly. that was my dream. And my mum, very typical Iranian mum, said to me, no, you need to become a doctor, a medical doctor. That's the only way, I didn't leave my country for you to come and study history because there's no jobs in history. But I was quite persistent. I said, no, I really want to study history and archaeology. So that's where I started. And I started at University of Gotland, which is now part of Uppsala University. But back then it was its own kind of university. And they're quite famous for their archaeology degree and program. So that's where I started. And during one summer excavation, we were excavating because in that degree program, because Gotland is one of those like very rich archaeological islands with a lot of prehistoric kind of graves and sites. It's quite famous in Sweden and in Baltic countries around to be quite famous for prehistoric events. And it's a Viking island. So we were doing excavations every summer. And for my first year summer excavation, we came across these kind of burials. And there was this woman on site who was not an archaeologist, but she kind of taught us how to handle the skeletal remains, how to collect them, took them to a triage point where she kind of made these assessment of sex and estimations of age and ancestry, or what is now referred to as population affinity. And I kind of thought, oh, wow, that is so interesting. So I started to ask questions and said, how do you know all of this? And that it turns out that she was an osteologist by training, but also told me that she's been doing some international work on human rights excavations, etc. So that's where my interest of bones kind of sparked, because I just thought that it was just so interesting and fascinating how she could basically tell the stories of these burials and skeletal remains. So I asked her, how do I become a forensic anthropologist or osteologist? And she said, well, first you need to study a bit of anatomy and change your major. So that's what I did. I started to kind of read osteology more, and then to gain that kind of more anatomy forensic side of things, I did an internship with forensic pathologists up north. And during this internship, I learned a lot about the forensic aspects and decomposition and everything that had to do with forensic investigations, because obviously forensic pathologists, they work quite closely with the police in forensic investigations. And I learned quite a lot. And by the end of my internship, I told them, I said, okay, I'm finishing up my degree now. And you know what? I don't want to be a forensic anthropologist. I want to become a forensic pathologist. What do I need to do? And they said to me, well, Sherry, you need to go to med school. And I thought, I can't do that, because if I do, that means my mom was right. And I don't want her to be right. I said, surely there must be another way. And they said, actually, we think that you should move to the UK, because this is, we're talking, do I even dare to say it, maybe 15 years ago or something? And UK was very prominent in their forensic degrees, at least back then, and had a really good reputation. So they said to me, you should study forensic anthropology in the UK. And they kind of put me in contact with different universities that I could do so. And that's how I ended up doing my first master's in forensic biological anthropology at Bournemouth University. And I learned a lot during that time. But it was actually during one of my lectures at Bournemouth University, where it was a psychology lecture, and they started to introduce the concept of decision-making and decision-making theories and how that actually could relate to forensic decision-making. And I thought, oh, hang on a minute, this is quite interesting. The whole concept of how do we make decision, what are our decision based upon? And that's also the first time that I was exposed to the concept of what is known as cognitive biases and how they operate and how our brain process and store information. And I thought, this is so fascinating, because a lot of the time I felt during my education was that a lot of the method that I was heavily trained in were subjective by nature. And I was constantly told that the more you practice, depending on, the skeletal remains that you are working at. So in Sweden, we had obviously a lot of archaeological remains, and it was the same at Bournemouth. The collection was from archaeological remains. And this obviously made me starting to think about, but can I actually transfer these skills into modern population? And how where does my expertise kick in versus somebody who works at casework and do a lot of analysis? And how can I combine the psychology of making a decision with the method that we are currently using? So that's when I started to become more interesting in the decision-making aspect of forensic anthropology. And that's when I did my first kind of master's dissertation on cognitive bias in trauma analysis. And this was kind of encouraged by my lecturers back then at Bournemouth to continue doing this and do a PhD. And they highlighted that there was a good PhD program at UCL with a really good forensic department. So that's when I applied to do a PhD at UCL, but my PhD was a 4-year PhD. So you did a master's in research as your first year, followed with a PhD. But that's how I ended up doing my PhD work in cognitive bias in forensic anthropology. And then I follow this with a postdoc position where I took this a little bit further in terms of merging in technology and decision making in skeletal remains. And that's kind of where my research changed a little bit into having the aspect of technology involved. And after my 2 years of postdoc, I got the position as a lecturer, but I'm still obviously continuing doing research in that area. So that's kind of my way into where I am today. And as you can see, it's definitely not a straight line. It's very wonky, back and forth, and switching countries, etc. But yeah, that's essentially the summary of it.
I don't know. It sounds kind of typical, I would think, for a lot of people who kind of stumble into forensics, because it is applied. And you have to have, that skill set or that education base in order to apply it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about the transferable skills as well, and learning from, I think I was very, very lucky to be able to work with great osteologists and archaeologists, fantastic forensic pathologists, and then move on to learn from what I still believe were the best lecturers I've ever had at Bournemouth University, who taught me everything there is to know about biological anthropology, and then being able to apply that more broadly into forensic science, and being in a department that truly embeds the ethos of interdisciplinary approaches to problem solving, etc. Because a lot of the maybe historical or bioarchaeological programs may not necessarily take the same interdisciplinary approach, but I would definitely say that the Department of Security and Crime Science and the Centre for Forensic Science, where I'm based, is extremely kind of open to interdisciplinary approaches. And that's where the application of psychological theories to forensic anthropology kind of came in, and I could, I had a safe space to do that type of research, so to speak.
Oh, very cool. Okay. You've said so many things that I just want to dive into. Let's go back to talking about working with archaeological samples, because as you mentioned, they can be quite different from a modern population. And often with archaeological samples, it's whatever we're digging up at the time. That's our sample. We don't really have a choice in what we're researching. We can't go out and recruit people and do a test, a sample population or a sample size of the entire human population. If we're digging up a cemetery, then that's our sample. And so making inferences from that sample about whatever might be going on in that culture or population at the time. I mean, there's problems with that, but then also using that archaeological sample to then make inferences about a human population, that has issues too.
Absolutely. I think there is, both pros and cons working with archaeological sample, at least from my experience, even moving countries and being exposed to different types of archaeological samples from different periods and different population groups. I was trained on archaeological samples from a more kind of Scandinavian population, whilst when I moved to the UK, it was very much UK based, obviously. And I think my time with a medical examiner made me realize that some of the methods that I'm using, and for example, using on archaeological samples, is going to create a completely different threshold compared to if I would use this method on modern population. So I do believe that working on, specifically if you're going to work in a forensic anthropology domain, it's good to get that experience of casework. And I do believe that in America, a lot of the degree programs do include students to be able to work on casework, etc. But I did get the opportunity of working with cases for when I did my internship at the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, because I did definitely acknowledge the limitation that I've actually not been around a real kind of forensic anthropology investigation, even though I've been part of a forensic setting with the medical examiners. It was only one case back then in Sweden which involved skeletal remains. But in essence, the method that you use to create an osteobiography is essentially the same methods that you use to establish a biological profile. So the method in itself is probably the same, but I think we need to be cautious for when it comes to the interpretation and also understand the limitations within that method, regardless if you apply it on an archaeological sample or in a modern sample. Just to give you an example of when this could go a bit wrong is actually coming from an archaeological example where in Sweden we had this kind of in museums we had exhibitions where of warriors, so Viking warriors. And I remember these exhibitions used to look at these skeletal remains that were beautifully laid out, and they used to tell the story of these really kind of fighting warrior white Viking men, and you could see the artifacts that were kind of found with the grave context, etc. So I grew up seeing all of these exhibitions and associating Viking warriors with males. That was what I was taught 15 years ago. But a couple of years ago, there was actually a research paper that came out from Sweden with a bunch of researchers that have taken now DNA samples of one of the most famous Viking warriors that's been on display in different museums. And it turned out actually that Viking warrior was not a man. It was more in characteristics with a woman. It was a Viking female woman. And it showed, it was so funny because we have been then up to that point reading that grave context and that part of history a bit wrong in terms of only associating warriors with men. And quite interestingly, when I read the research paper, it was very much highlighted that the osteologists back in the 1980s or whenever these skeletal remains were excavated, that person actually did highlight that, I don't know, the osteology analysis is coming out more in line with what we would characterize as more female kind of estimations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it was the grave context with the, swords and the historians who were kind of pushing for that, no, impossible, it must be a man. And so, it's quite interesting to see how that context could definitely impact upon the interpretation of what we see in that archaeological sample. But if you get a piece of history wrong, you might have some debates about it. People might, have some, I would say, constructive debates about it. But it wasn't as if there was a war going on now between the historians and the people who did the genetical analysis, etc. Because it is quite given that we might get history wrong. It is quite comfortable to take on that. Oh, okay, now we know this, and what does this mean, and how can we work with the new information that we have? Whilst I feel like in forensic settings and in criminal justice settings, getting something wrong literally have such severe direct impact upon people's lives which maybe getting something historically wrong might not have the same impact, direct impact upon people's livelihoods or just in terms of even incarcerations or freedom, that getting something forensically wrong is probably more damaging than getting something historically wrong, if you understand what I mean by that.
Yeah, the stakes are much, much higher in forensic situations, whereas
exactly.
in academia, we have the luxury of debating something for decades. Yeah, we can waffle and go back on our decisions and in academia and
absolutely.
20 years ago we thought this, but now we think this, and in 20 years from now we might think this, and that's okay. But in forensics, you can't do that.
No, and I do think, though, that it's healthy to have these debates about, this is also where I'm quite big on the whole transparency of science in general. I think it's very important to be able to know our limitations, to be quite comfortable to talk about the limitations, similar to what people do in medicine and other fields. Whilst I think forensic science is still quite shying away from perhaps openly discuss what we are asked to do and what we actually can do. And I did find it really, really useful to spend some time with what I still consider the best forensic anthropologist that I've ever came across in New York, and follow them and see their workflow and what amazing work they're doing and how that actually sits within the criminal justice system, and learn from them and how this actually works on modern population, the challenges you face, and how you overcome those challenges. And it's, because forensic anthropology essentially sits within part of a criminal investigation. So you don't work in isolation. You normally, if there are skeletal remains involved, there are other things happening simultaneously as well. It's not just, your job might just be to analyze the skeletons and write a expert report on the skeletons, but the investigation in itself includes so many other bits. And I think up to that point, I never really saw how that sits within, from a holistic point of view, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up some very interesting points about, what an expert is, what they're perceived to be. And an expert isn't just to know what they know black and white and that's it. And it's more about knowing your limits, knowing what you don't know, and knowing that you don't know, and stating that, being transparent about that.
I think, that there is this kind of beauty in a way that we have expert witnesses, and that we can rely upon experts to kind of convey and communicate essentially the science to a jury or a judge, and be part of, what they did during that investigation, etc. But as you pointed out, it's really important to be transparent and open about the limitation of the method that we have used, and also the limitations of our expertise. And I sometimes feel, at least from observing from some of the courts that I've attended, is that the language that is spoken in court, the language of law, is sometimes not the same language as science. And that can become quite tricky. Just to give you an example, I was in New York, and luckily during that time when I was doing my internship for the OCME, I got to go to court and watch a very high profile case where one of the forensic anthropologists from the OCME was given expert witness. So I thought, I'll go to this and follow the case, because I just found it very fascinating. And I could definitely see that the language spoken by the defense lawyer, when they were trying to get the forensic anthropologist to say something that was completely irrelevant, had nothing to do with what they actually did. And I will never forget how well, composed and articulated and calm the forensic anthropologist was, to the point where actually the judge had to jump in and tell the defense lawyer off and say, you're just asking essentially the most stupid questions, because this is not what this forensic anthropologist is here to answer. Obviously didn't put it in that way, but
yes,
you know,
yeah.
can counsel come up and we can have a chat, basically. That was what he did. And I just thought, wow, it is really hard. It's not easy to sit at court and trying to use a language that is understood by people outside of your expertise. And then at the same time, sometimes, not always, have defense lawyers who might push you to say things outside of your expertise. But again, this forensic anthropologist did such a beautiful job. And that's also when I saw, you know, their aim, the defense lawyer's aim, or whoever it is, the prosecution's aim, is going to be completely different to what the expert is there for. And I would never forget, the forensic anthropologist told me, Bashiri, because I asked them, how did you, I'm so impressed, like I would have crumbled, like I don't know how you dealt with that impression. They said, because my duty is to the court. And I think that's important to remember. My duty is to the court. And I think that's, you know, it sat with me quite well, that sentence, essentially. Yeah, my duty is to the court. So that's something that I tell my students as well, that they should bear in mind, that our duties is not to, you know, work for the prosecution or work for the defense. You might, you know, be called for the prosecution or called from the defense to review a case or write a report, but your duty should always be to the court. And therefore, we need to be transparent, and we need to speak in a manner and write reports in a manner that is understood by people outside of our expertise as well.
Yeah. I actually said something very similar to, I think, a landowner. I was out doing an archaeological survey or something.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, my client was oil and gas, and the landowners, you know, well, you just want to put the pipeline through. I said, no, my duty is to the historic resource. Yeah. I am here to represent that. Beyond that, I have no bias. Yeah. I'm here to represent the resource. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's it's high stakes, high emotions in forensics, especially when you're in court. Everybody wants answers.
Oh, absolutely. The worst thing you can, you know, science is all about testing hypotheses and be quite transparent. And court is very much kind of like, did he or did he not do this? Can we say that this DNA is very much more direct? It doesn't really like ambiguity, at least from the experience that I have had watching other experts give evidence and looking at reviews for defense in terms of expert witness reports, etc. It's completely two different ways of communicating, and it's quite fascinating to see those two worlds kind of integrate with each other. But as you said, I find it really interesting that you said that, no, my duty is, you know, to this, and I'm not going to be biased. And I think a lot of people, especially when I did my experiment, I definitely got some really good constructive criticism. Some of it was extremely helpful, and it was, you know, a lot of really good forensic anthropologists reached out to me. Even when I was in New York, I had really good chats with really good anthropologists, and I still work with a lot of people from the US today. Have mentors in forensic anthropology who kind of, you know, not necessarily challenged me in a negative way, but said, but did you think about this variable, or did you think about doing it this way, or what about that? And that's science, you know, to have that communication, to openly be able to constructively have conversations about, okay, now that we know this, can we look at maybe that variable? Because we have to bear in mind that a lot of the experiments that we do when we are testing for certain types of conditions or variable are extremely controlled. They're done in extremely controlled environments, and they have to, because, you know, you have to count for the variables that you are testing for. But this also means that when we are transferring that into having ecological validity, it might be a bit trickier. So obviously that pushed me to think a bit differently. And I've always said this. I said this to my supervisor at the time, Professor Ruth Morgan. I said to her, I don't know if you felt this way when you finished your PhD, but I felt like I've answered some questions, but answering those questions raised about 100 new questions. So I feel like I need about 20, 30 more lifetimes in order to be able to, you know, solve the puzzle. And she said, but that's how you are supposed to feel. I guess that's science. What I know today is not necessarily what I knew 10 years ago. And I think that's quite important, to constantly look to evolve and constantly be curious and not say, oh, okay, well, I know this now, therefore that's the ground truth and nothing else matters. That's not necessarily how science works. And we can only do better based upon the information that we have today, and work with that, which means that, in 10 years, this might not look like you and I will have this conversation in 10 years. I hope still that I will say the same thing, that, I've learned so much now during these 10 years that I've actually changed my mind about 100 times around. So because that's all we can do.
Right. So let's talk about your research. So I've got some of your papers on my desk right now. You've published a lot. So, yeah, I couldn't get through them all, unfortunately.
Oh, please. Literally, I feel bad for people who have to read academic papers. Surely they must be the most boring thing. Aside from other academics, they find them really amusing. But
well, I do believe that, you do have to have a background in academia in order to know how to read an academic paper.
Yeah.
Because, otherwise they are dry as dust.
Absolutely.
So if we could, let's start kind of at the beginning, where you're talking about the forensic anthropology and the grave materials, the materials buried with the individual, their clothing and the other materials, versus the osteology.
Yeah.
And then we'll go into some of the other stuff with decision making in forensic science.
Yes. One of the earlier experiments that I did during my PhD was obviously to look at, initial exposure to context. So, for example, because I knew, and I've learned now through doing the work with the OCME, that it's quite a dynamic environment. And what happens if we look at different types of psychological theories, there's a lot about belief perseverance, confirmation bias, or even kind of initial exposure and priming to a certain hypothesis, and that people tend to hold on to those hypotheses even though if contradictory evidence is presented. So one of my research projects that I did as part of my PhD was to look at what will happen if I would bury, say, for example, male skeletal casts, so skeletal casts that are used to look more at male characteristics, features, and if I will then dress them in what might be perceived as more, in terms of gender, more female kind of interpretation versus what might be perceived as more kind of male clothing versus female clothing, and will that then impact upon the people who are doing the excavation? They will excavate the skeletal remains. They will see, initial hypothesis might be, it's a woman because she's wearing a skirt or whatever she's doing. And then when they do the analysis, is that initial kind of biasing information of the clothing, is that going to hold on for when they do sex estimation at a later stage? And what my study overall showed, that it was not the fact that they kind of swapped and said, yes, it's 100, or kept their initial hypothesis of being 100%, it's I'm estimating this skeleton to be female. It wasn't necessarily that. It was the fact that people who were not exposed to that context and people who were exposed to what could be perceived as more gender neutral clothing, they all were much more confident and more certain in saying that the skeletal cast were male or male ? When you look at the group that were exposed to the same kind of skeletal cast, but with a different initial kind of information of female clothing, it kind of primed them and it knocked off their confidence in their decision making. And it wasn't the fact that they said it's 100% female, but they put themselves in the middle, even though the forensic analysis of the skeletal remains, the metric ones that they did came out obviously more male. And when they were doing the visual analysis of the skeletal remains, they tend to put themselves in the middle, so scoring a 3 rather than maybe a 4 or a 5 compared to the other group, for example, when looking at the skull. So that was, for me, quite interesting in how context do play a role, at least with that sample size. And bear in mind that I used students. It was hidden in one of their final exams. It was a lot of ethics went into kind of going around this. And when I present this research to my students today, do you know what they say? They say to me, but do you think students would do it the same now when we kind of have come into this whole debate of, what identify as gender, etc., and maybe and I thought that was so interesting. I said, you know what, that's so interesting. You might have a point, because bear in mind that this study was done 2000 and what was it, maybe 16 or 15. So we're talking almost 9 years ago, and I just thought that was interesting, and I absolutely said, of course, replicate the study. And it's important to say that a study was obviously done with students, and some people raised the fact that, but do you think you would have the same results if it was with experts, etc.? And I said, I have no idea. Well, I was transparent in my study that what sample size I use. I was transparent about the limitations as well. So, of course, by all means, replicating it with expert might give a completely different result. Or it might give the same result. I have no idea. That's, the whole point of testing your hypothesis and having update your research questions and continuing doing those studies, of course.
But it also can bring into the question of conscious bias versus unconscious bias, because if 20 years ago people didn't realize that they were influenced by the clothing on the analysis of the skeletal remains, that's one thing. But then 20 years later, nowadays people might now be more conscious of that bias that the clothing makes upon an analysis of skeletal remains.
No, absolutely. I do think that the conversation around bias in general has definitely grown within the forensic community. You can see that maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was quite a lot of, it was almost like a naughty word. If you said that you did research in cognitive bias, it wasn't you. If I put it this way, I wasn't the most popular person back in my PhD years. But actually, that also made me realize how important communication is, and building that trust with experts and talking to them and inviting them into the conversation and actually understanding the workflow and working closely with them, which is the things I did obviously for my postdoc and things that I do now. But you're absolutely right. We have I think there is a very small, and please don't quote me on this, this is just me assuming that people are quite willingly now know about cognitive bias, and they definitely know about its impact in the criminal justice system and also across different types of forensic domains in general, or disciplines. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just knowing about it will shield you from it.
Exactly. I was
it's
just
not necessarily an
yes.
ethical issue, or I know about it, but it depends on, what you see now is how people review how they do cases and how the workflow is looking like. Are you doing blind peer reviews? Are you having access to context prior or after? And people always ask me, so what do you think? Do you think that we should go in completely blind? And I say, absolutely not. I actually do think that context could help in a lot of situations, but it's about knowing when the context is helpful and when it's actually needed. Sometimes I don't necessarily need to know the DNA analysis of the bones prior to me doing my analysis on the bones, but I can take part of that after I've done the analysis, for example, because it's important. It's important for me to know, the DNA analysis, that the sample that I took from the bone and what the DNA expert did, etc. So of course that information is important, but do I really need that prior to making my analysis? No, for example. But then if you look at trauma analysis, that might look completely different. You need the context around, what happens specifically for when it comes to mass grave excavations, etc., to be able to put that trauma into context.
Mm.
So it's not a black and white, at least not for me. Some might argue against this. I have a lot of psychologists who will argue that we should think about this in terms of relevant versus irrelevant context. Some people think that we can go in fully blindly, but I don't think that context is necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's where the conversation, I feel, sometimes differs now. It's bias always being put in terms of a bad thing. You know, I don't know if you ever thought about these optic illusions that you see, and sometimes you can't even distinguishing what it is that you're looking at. But as soon as somebody tells you, oh, you're looking at a cow, or it's Jesus on a toast, or whatever these optic illusions normally shows, and you all of a sudden are like, oh yeah, I can see it now. So, you know, that information could sometimes be helpful for you to be able to see things that your brain has subconsciously or effectively filtered out. So for me, it's never been about trying to control the environment, but trying to understand that environment and having a more kind of holistic approach to the transparency part of the methods that we are using, how we are using them, where are the limitations, and where could we kind of, you know, move on, knowing what we know now.
But it's also realizing that we're all human beings and we are perceiving the world through our eyes, and we're also individuals. So all of that learned experience, skills, that is influencing how we as a human being are perceiving the world. And I think that's important to at least be aware of.
I mean, we all come from different experience and we go through life in different ways. And I think a very famous psychologist once said, the mind is not a camera. You know, you don't go through life and being able to record and remember and retrieve everything just purely because you've experienced it. You know, memory fade over time, the way that we feel about certain events or the way that we learn changes over time. It's a lot of, you know, factors that impact upon who we are as humans. And obviously there is a level of professionalism that we bring to our work. Of course, we are going to do our best to be completely unbiased and completely, you know, objective to anything we approach us. But no human being on this planet is fully objective. It doesn't work like that. And I think anybody who takes psychology A or B will understand that trying to reach, you know, objectivity to the standard of 100% is never going to, it's just not possible. It's not possible. And that's not because we're bad people or we don't want to. It's because, as you pointed out, we go through life and we experience life, and those experiences and impressions and stimuli are going to impact upon essentially what we see, how we see things, and how we interpret things. Rather, how can we increase transparency in what we do, how we do it, and how we go about tasks? And, you know, I think that's probably more important. And learning from different psychological theories. It's really interesting when you talk to psychologists about your research, and I say, oh, I studied, you know, cognitive bias in this. And they always say, but there are about 1 million other decision-making theories that could either explain your results or you should explore. And that also made me realize that, yeah, that's actually true. We've really just focused upon one aspect, and specifically in forensic science, it's been very much focused upon contextual bias or confirmation bias. But now I'm working with psychologists and decision-making experts that, you know, how can we use, for example, Bayes networks to be more transparent about how we combine different types of evidence. And there is, you know, a variety of different decision-making theories out there that I haven't had a chance to explore. So I'm very happy that I get to do that now and work with other aspects of decision-making to try to understand how we go about certain tasks.
There you go. There's another 20, 30 lifetimes worth of questions
Exactly.
waiting to
You
be answered.
I just need to, I just need to redo everything again.
Not redo it, because I mean, everything that you've
no.
done is a building block to get where you are now.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes you think about, you know, where do I see, because I love forensic anthropology. I honestly do. I remember some of the criticism that I got at the beginning was, you might really hate your discipline. And absolutely not. I think, you know, I've only met really talented, hardworking, great forensic anthros that literally have contributed to the body of knowledge in the way they do research, in the way that they've discovered methods, etc. So I have huge respect for the discipline and the people who are working within the discipline. I think what I try to understand now is, where do I see this discipline fit within what I refer to, or many refer to, as the fourth industrial revolution. We are in a world where technology is starting to take over, and that's an area that I'm very interested in terms of, could we, through the help of technology, try to merge the human and the computer or the machine together to be even more accurate in our decision making and push for more transparent decision making, etc. So it's that merging between how experts and technology can work together. That's a really, really interesting and a passion of mine right now, actually.
Oh my, that sounds like a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah, maybe.
I've been really taken up with ChatGPT and Midjourney. They're my two new best friends. I love them both. Yeah. I totally get where you're coming from. It's very attractive, and the potential is just fantastic.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people get really scared about, is machines going to take over humans? I say to my students, no, it's about us now learning different skill sets. So the skill set maybe that I learned 15 years ago might not be as applied in 15 years. So it's important that we also, as a discipline, move within the world that we are currently within, and don't get too comfortable to rely upon, maybe methods that were conducted about, 50, 60 years ago, because they might have worked on that population at that given time, and they probably still do perform quite well across different types of population, depending upon what sample you have, the experience of the observer, etc. But does that mean that we're happy with that? Or are we just going to say, okay, let's just stop then? And that's not necessarily science. You always have to push. Even I would say, when you reach 99.99999, it's not like you can put up your feet and be like, okay, we're done now. It's not about that. It's about, constantly evolving, because the world will change. Right. And it's just not gonna, if we don't move with it, I feel like we're gonna fall behind.
Well, just to make sure that we end on a good note, because we did kind of slam archaeology a little bit in the beginning.
Oh, no. I did it again. Just remember, to anybody who's listening, I really wanted to become an archaeologist. I have a huge amount of respect for archaeologists as well.
So what's something that you learned during that time? A lesson, a way of perceiving the world, an approach? What's something that you learned from archaeology way back when that you still carry with you now?
I think what I definitely learned is that it's okay to be wrong. And that is something that I felt, at least during my degree. I can't speak for all archaeology degrees. And also, I must say, for my biological anthropology degree, because the people who trained me also some of them came from archaeological background, was that, it's okay to have uncertainties. They had this kind of beautiful way of wanting to embrace uncertainty in a way. And they were like, we think this might have happened, but this is just, it's not 100%, but we're quite comfortable being able to draw this conclusion. And it's okay. That a bit of uncertainty is definitely okay, because they could only hypothesize. And in archaeology specifically, what I learned is that you can only say what you can say based upon the information you have at that time. And I think that's a very good lesson that I brought with me into, I have huge amount of respect for at least for the archaeologists that I've worked with so far.
All right. Well, I'm conscious of the time. Is there anything else that either we didn't touch on or that you would like to say before we close?
No, I just kind of want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of talk about some of my thoughts. And it's just been so wonderful to have this conversation with you, Yvonne. It's a really good platform that you have, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.